my chair around?
Yes.
I don't know where I'm supposed to be.
You're welcome to sit up there up front.
It's like everyone's a million miles away when you're up there.
Yeah, well, I can just sit right, I mean, it don't matter to me. I don't like to have my back to people. Even though it's more comfortable that way, but still, okay. First of all, I guess I want to say thank you to Synteglishka for having these forums again. We've kind of been in hiatus for a while. Excuse me. And I know that over the years, a lot of people have benefited from this because I would always hear comments about, the forums after they were over and some of the topics that were being talked about and how they impact us from an individual perspective. Today, as Dan mentioned, he wanted me to talk a little bit about the Indian Child Welfare Act. And the first thing that I always try to do when I talk about this particular subject is I remember all of the individuals that were impacted by removal from their families prior to the Indian Child Welfare Act. Because people need to understand that there was a reason why the Indian Child Welfare Act come into play. So I think of the mothers, I think of the fathers, I think of the grandparents, and certainly I think of the children. And I always try to get people with this frame of mind that whether we're aware of it or not, a lot of those individuals are still amongst us. And I'm talking about the ones that were pre-ICWA. It wasn't too terribly long ago that a lot of these individuals were totally impacted by a lot of the policies that were going on back in those days. I have a personal vested interest in this, and I always go so far as to say that it was because of people like my mom that ICWA exists. And I'm going to share a little bit about what I went through from a personal perspective. I want to talk about kind of how ICWA has developed over the years, and then we'll kind of talk a little bit about where it's at the United States Supreme Court today. So that's kind of just like a real quick layout. I don't know how much time we have to do all of this, so I can do 4 hours that Dan and Ted talked about, or I can do 4 minutes. I mean, I'm good in either way. Just kidding.
Should we shoot for an hour?
Okay, that'll work.
For presentation and discussion and try to wrap up round 2.
Okay, that works for me. Again, from a personal perspective, when I got involved in Synteglishka, it was a very, very long time ago. I was a student at Synte in fall of 1981. And that experience, as I've said on more than one occasion, really kind of opened my eyes to a lot of the things that were going on in the world. I was very limited as to what life was all about until I came here, and I enjoyed the fact that it was open enough where I could kind of look at classes that meant something to me, and I really enjoyed that back in those days, so that was kind of fun. One of the things that I learned to do early on was look at a lot of different books and how they impacted life today. And one of the books that I just came across not too terribly long ago, this thing hit me like a ton of bricks, and I want to share a little passage out of this book kind of as a history to the ICWA idea. It'll take me a couple of seconds to read it, but I want you to pay attention to what's being said. The Indian shelter is closed. The cornerstone of the children's home says shelter home. And for several years, the facility was referred to as the children's shelter. In 1963, the board decided to call it the children's home, with the explanation that a shelter is not all that children without a home need. references were made to the girl's family and the boy's family. The home had originally been filled to its capacity of 60 children, but enrollment gradually declined to between 20 and 30. And by the mid-60s, major concerns were being raised about the long-term welfare of those who lived there. These were little children without the security of parents or a home of their own, unhappy, lacking in self-esteem, unable to trust adults, the world, or even themselves. Many could not accept this love. Some were suspicious and rejecting. Some grew strong, others remained weak. A community consisting of social workers, church leaders, and local Indian residents conducted a comprehensive study for the Reformed Church, and in 1968, the committee reported its belief that long-term institutional care was not in the best interest for homeless children, recommending instead a foster home placement program. At this spring 1969 meeting, the General Program Council voted to close the home as a long-term care facility. When I read that, I realized that they were talking about me. I was one of those kids that was in that home. Now, I just come across this book a year ago, and it was published in 2015. And what I've tried to get people to understand over the years is that prior to the Indian Child Welfare Act being passed, there was a lot of devastation that took place. And in today's time, when I work with individuals, when I work with students, when I work with people in general, I'm always mindful of the fact that they have a history that they're bringing into this conversation. And I always let them know that they're welcome to share what they want to share, because that's one of the things that a lot of us were kind of denied of. Between 1950 and 1970, there was a project that was passed called the Indian Adoption Project. And a lot of Native American children were removed during that time. And like I said before, I was one of those kids. Some of them, they're still alive today. Some of them might be frequenting classrooms and all these other kinds of things. So when I talk to individuals, I have them be mindful that when you talk about certain subjects, you're triggering people, whether you're aware of it or not. And if you say the wrong thing and there's no preference to it, don't be surprised if they don't come back. It's not anything that's intentional, but again, my point being, for the longest time, there has been so much about Native American culture that has been omitted from the education world, that a lot of our people today are very unfamiliar with what went on in the past. And I've always taken offense to that. What I do today is I try to incorporate a lot of Native American culture into the classroom, because it's certainly a lot to be proud of. We've come a long way, and we've done a lot of things over the years. And I think, like I said, people need to be a little bit mindful of, just how resourceful the Native American community is. Not too terribly long ago, I went back home. And those of you who are wondering, is Dwayne from here? No, I'm not. I am from the Winnebago tribe of Nebraska. When I was removed in 1968, I was placed in 4 foster homes within a month's period, and learn about rejection early on. You go to one home and they, real quickly, the first home that I went to, they wanted an Indian boy, but they didn't want 2. So we were out, me and my brother thankfully was with me, so I had him. Another home that we went to, they just changed their mind. Well, we wanted to get, now we don't. And be mindful of the fact that we're sitting in this vehicle listening to these conversations. And so again, we learned early on about rejection. Another home that we were placed in, they wanted to, they were getting ready to go on vacation. And their idea of vacation was to visit all of the local churches in the area. And my brother said, oh, that ain't gonna happen. So I always blamed him for the third one. The fourth one was kind of a latch dish effort. And I ended up in a town not too terribly far from here called Ainsworth, Nebraska. And from 1968 up until 1980, that's where I basically lived. So that was kind of interesting. In that period, one of the things that never ever came up was the fact that I was Native American descent. We never talked about the fact that I was an Indian. It never came up in our conversation. And if you want to understand that, imagine being just invisible. Because I always look at the 1950s and the 1970s as that invisible generation. We're always kind of set off to the side. Even in today's time, for the last 40-some years, I've been very adamant about the Indian Child Welfare Act. I've been getting involved every opportunity that I can, just to understand a lot of the things that are going on. As a matter of fact, today, I'm referred to as a foster parent. And sitting here, I would tell people, be very, 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 very open-minded about that process. Because I'll share with you very quickly, and I'm not trying to offend people, but what I do is I tell truths. Becoming a foster parent, and initially it was through the state, and I had never been so humiliated in my life just to become a foster parent. Some of the processes that I was up against, I had to get 3 people that would basically vouch for me, for lack of a better term, that I was even probably alive, for lack of a better term. And the other thing that was really kind of insulting to me was that they wanted to interview my kids, which I thought was kind of interesting because my kids weren't in my home. They didn't live there. And some of the questions that were asked of my kids is where I took offense. After the initial person interviewed one of my daughters called me and she was sad. She said, Dad, I just got off the phone with that individual about you becoming a foster parent, and the questions that they asked me were really interesting. And I said, what do you mean? She said, one of the things that they wanted to know was, would I feel comfortable about leaving my kids with you? That hurt. I was sitting there like, holy moly, it's interesting. And that wasn't the only time. Like I said, they interviewed all of my kids. Now, I have been affiliated with, again, the Indian Child Welfare Act since its inception. And like I said, in the early days, I always contend again that my mom was a reason why this thing exists. And so everything that I do on behalf of her. Because my mom didn't have a say. My mom did not have a say into what was happening. And one of the things that's really interesting is, again, not too terribly long ago, I was able to open my records. Because a lot of our records are sealed. A lot of individuals that get into this foster care system, you don't have access to your records. And it depends basically on states whether they're going to open them or not. Thankfully for me, I was able to open up my records. And I was able to read everything that happened from 1969 up until 1980. And it was really sad reading, to be honest with you. But it was almost a monthly account of everything that went on. In the world of human services, we call it case study. You get to read your case studies. And like I said, they were very, very explicit about things. But there was one particular thing that really caught my eye. And that very simply was this. That the reason that I was removed from my family was because they said that my mom had an alcohol problem and the fact that she was a single mother. Those 2 reasons. And as I'm reading this paper about all of this, like I said, my file, as I'm reading this, nowhere ever did it ever come up where they offered her any kind of help? Never once did I come across anything that said that she might need to go to treatment, she might need to go to parenting, anything. It never said anything about that. And so I look at it from that perspective of being in that system and understanding, like I said, the impact that it has on all of us. Ted talked about, not too terribly long ago, the Secretary of the Interior came here and they talked about the boarding school era. And a lot of those individuals, again, some of them, depending on age, are still a part of our communities. And what I try to do, again, is just to get people in this frame of mind that this is a very strong reality. The way that I teach a lot of my classes is not the way that a lot of people do things. Every individual that walks into my classroom, they walk in with a history. They're not this empty vessel that I'm going to fill all full of knowledge. They have something to offer. And I open up that door in the event that they want to share something, that they're welcome to do so. But I caution them. Be sure that you're comfortable with what you're going to talk about. Because some of the topics that come up in the human service world, very, very personal stuff. It may not be intended, but like I said, when you talk about these kind of things, people get triggered in certain areas. And that is what we need to be very, very mindful of all the time. I've been affiliated with Sinteglishka. I think I started working here as a community coordinator in 1987. I was also a GED tester. But one of the things that I loved back at that time was being in community coordination. I got to go to all the outlying communities and visit with people, and understand again from their perspective all of the things that were of interest to them. So I had a very, very fascinating education, aside from the fact that I went to school. So that was always kind of fun. All of the stuff that I'm talking about, it does deal specifically with the Indian Child Welfare Act, because all of these individuals, like I said, that we are talking about, are affected to some degree. How many of you in here, and the camera's not going to be on you, so if you want to answer, go ahead. If you don't, are familiar with the Indian Child Welfare Act, or at least have heard of it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay. How many of you in here know of somebody that was directly affected through foster care? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. All of those kinds of things, like I said, they're important because we all have that sense of history about us. I look back over the years, and like I said, I've been at this a couple of days. And I've seen some changes, but I've also seen where a lot of things need to be corrected. I look at the system and how it's set up. When I first found out that they were going to bring the ICWA to the United States Supreme Court, I was a little bit nervous. And I'm still nervous right now because I don't know what the outcome's going to be. Any of you can at any time type in Indian Child Welfare Act, Supreme Court, and it'll knock you off your chair as to the conversation that's going on out there. But what's really significant is the impact that it's going to have on reservations in general. Again, in a lot of my classes, I try to educate people so that they understand the environment that they're living in. And years ago, I was had the opportunity of taking classes with a gentleman by the name of Frank Palmershine. Some of y'all might know him, remember him. There was a book that he did that talked about all of the policies, that affected the Native American community. And so what I do with those policies is I introduce them into my classes. And I ask my students to go back to the policy that first affected them. And depending on what age you are, a lot of the younger people, they can only go back as far as the 61 Act or policy, which deal with self-determination and education and whatnot. People like myself, we go back to termination. I come from the termination era. And the intent of termination, obviously, was to do away with tribes. People don't like me saying that, but that's the reality. And one of the ways that they did it, again, was by removing a lot of our children. I come from a state that was hit directly hard because I lived in Nebraska. And there was 5 states that were directly affected by the PL 280 termination policy. Because they basically used us as kind of guinea pigs to see how that was all going to work. Subsequently, what happened was state and civil jurisdiction was turned over to the tribe. And I remember in my early years, I called back home. And I talked to some of our tribal leaders. And I asked them, where were you? When my mother was going through all of this chaos, where were you? Why didn't anybody help her? Why didn't anybody step up and say something? And again, they reminded me that at that time, this policy was in play, and they basically had a thumb over us. So I had to learn to live and forget, or forgive very quickly. I understood it, but it still didn't make any sense to me. I'm that kind of a person that I know that I am not going to get a formal apology for what they did to me. I'm never going to hear that. If it is, it'll be very watered down at best, because it needs to come from the top. But in that context, I don't have any animosity today. Like I said before, in moving over here, I've always looked at this environment, Rosebud in general, Centegoshka, the university, college back in my day, basically as my salvation. I come from a very, very, very rough background, and there was a lot of addiction in my life. And when I moved here, I was able to give all of that up. And I've shared with my classes, because I'm teaching classes right now, I shared with my class on January 23rd, I celebrated my 43rd sobriety birthday. Now I know anonymity, but I want to get that out because I think it's important. People need to understand that we can come from a very, very disruptive background and still land on our feet. It takes a little bit of work, and it certainly takes a tremendous amount of support. And I've always found that in this environment. Like I said, I've been here a couple of days and I've seen a lot of things. And I know that we need to do a lot more work in this particular area. ICWA today, I remember in 2013, I think it was, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, we tried to have a summit in Rapid City with all of the ICWA offices and state offices come together just to talk about the ICWA idea. And nobody from the state would show up. Nobody came. And again, nobody said anything. It is an uphill battle. Again, people, if they understand the long-term ramifications of the outcome of this decision that's going to come down, and I'm thinking it might come down in, I think I was told April or May. The United States Supreme Court is going to come to some kind of a decision on this particular court case. What I've wanted to have happen was all of the ICWA programs and all of the family services programs in the country get together and start having a summit and start talking about all of these kinds of things. Our kids are very, very important, but what's interesting to me is very few people even understand the Indian Child Welfare Act. So another question I pose is, how many of you have taken the time to read the Indian Child Welfare Act in its entirety? Okay. Looking at something that important and how it affects the tribe as a whole, like I said, what I'm hoping for down the road is that we start, community efforts of getting all of this kind of education back into our communities. Have somebody designated in each community to talk about these kinds of things. One thing that's really, really been kind of put off to the side or not really pushed as much is Indian foster parents. Like I said, I went through heck to get where I was. And like I said, I want somebody out there explaining to other people exactly what that entails, because it's not a tremendous amount of fun. I've heard of people in the past that wanted to become foster parents, but they couldn't live up to those standards, and they just said, I can't do this, and they stopped. And then you have another entity come around and say, well, see, we told you, they say their kids are sacred, but nobody wants to help them. I take offense to that kind of stuff, because like I said, I know what it entails to become that kind of a person. I mean, I have my great-granddaughter right now. I've had her for about 6 months, and I mean, it's like a new life, totally. I got to get back into the pamper world. I mean, it was really quite fascinating. Now she runs around. She's mouthy. You know, all of the things that I thought I got away from, starting all over again. So in that sense, I mean, it is really, really interesting. But again, I think what people wanted me to talk about was this whole idea of what the Indian Child Welfare Act is going to do to us as a whole. And like I said, we don't know at this point what direction the Supreme Court is going to go. I know there's a lot of concern at that level, because some of the justices, they don't know that much about Indian culture. And so they're looking at things from a totally different perspective. And over the years, I think a lot of times people, even in our own communities, don't know a lot about our own history. And so they take a different stance on a lot of things. And that's where things really begin to concern me. I think we need to be a little bit more proactive in a lot of the things that we do, as far as a community or an organization as a whole. Out in our communities, we need to have a little bit more conversation in particular areas. Some of the things that I've been working on in the past dealt with a healthy self and community. How do you develop a healthy self and community? Another thing that I talk about is talking about the oppression and the self-betrayal. A lot of us that come from that disruptive background, we carry a lot with us. And some of us are able to overcome, some of us get reminded and we start it all over again. But again, it needs to be support. We need to talk about that sense of loss. The way that I talk about sense of loss today deals with one of the conversations that people were having yesterday with our language. A lot of people today want to learn the language, but there's some kind of a barrier that's there. And I'll come along and I'll make a statement and it makes people mad. And I do that intentionally. I say in today's time, a lot of people don't learn their language is because they choose not to. And now everybody gets mad at me for saying that. And all I can say is prove me wrong. We have resources, we have family members, we have tapes, we have books, we have those little ear thingamabobbers. What do you call them things?
Earbuds.
Earbuds, yeah. I'm not real techie, so yeah. We have all of those things. Which can help us do that. All you do is put in something about the language on a tape recorder or on your phone, plug it in your ear and go drive around. You listen to this stuff enough and you're going to catch on. Take the time. I mean, it is available. So in that context, it does get really, really interesting. Another thing that happened to me, and like I said, all of this stuff is like just interesting developments. A year ago, I went back to where this book originated from, where they talked about the shelter home. I went back there a year ago, and my intention was to go into that building. I needed to do that for me. And so my wife and my little granddaughter we went back to my hometown. We went up to that building and I was working with some people in the museum. And so there were 3 other people that were there with us. So 3, 4, 5, 6 of us. And I remember walking toward that building and then I stopped. And I didn't want to go in. And I don't know why I felt like that, because it's just a building. And they encouraged me, especially my wife, but we come this far, you know how you guys are. So anyway, I went ahead and I went down into the basement. Now the basement basically was neutral ground. They had the rec area down there, and they had the kitchen down there, and it was okie dokie. You know, so I went down, I went in on the south side, went all the way through the building, over to the north side, and I met the gentleman that kind of ran that place and shared with him why I was there. And then they said, well, let's go up to the second floor. So you go back to the middle of the building. I went upstairs and I went back to the south side, and I just kind of looked around. I turned around and I started to walk back the other direction, and I got about halfway down there and I stopped. And I couldn't figure out why I stopped. There was this really uneasy feeling that come over me, and I'm like, wow, that's kind of interesting. And then it dawned on me that, like the book said, this place housed 60 kids at one time. The south side of the building was for the boys. The north side was for the girls. And we were not allowed to pass this certain, what I call a barrier. And that's what stopped me. And I couldn't believe after all those years, that hit me. I was like, wow, this is fascinating. And again, I went back down and I talked to the gentleman, you know, that was kind of taking care of that building. And I shared with him, you know, a lot of the stuff that I was feeling, and, you know, why I needed to go there, and all this fun stuff. And I remember driving home. And I knew that I needed to thank this guy, because when I got there, and his welcome really meant something to me. So when I got home, you know, I sent him an email, and I thanked him for the welcome that he gave me, because I shared with him that had been the first time that I had been in that building in 53 years. And it really meant a lot. Now I'm able to frequently go back, and I do. Surprisingly, and I think ironically to some extent, that building was once a shelter home for children. Today it's called Little Priest Tribal College. And I love the irony in that. I've been asked you know, to go back and do some work back there and just talk about that experience, because when I first got involved in this and I talked to the museum, I wanted to know the history about the shelter. And ironically, a lot of the people were a little bit taken back by that question. You know, what's this place all about? They weren't aware that it was a shelter back then. Some of them weren't aware. And so we're starting this connection back, you know, with this idea. We've even gone so far as to ask individuals that were a part of that place prior to it closing down if they want to, like, reconnect and try to have some kind of a reunion. I'm hoping that comes to fruition, because like I said, it will make a big difference to a lot of people. It really helped me kind of get over this little fear that I had, because again, our past tends to like creep up on us periodically. I was a little bit nervous again when they had the boarding school gathering here a while back, because I wasn't sure how that was going to turn out. I knew that it was going to open a lot of wounds. And I was just praying that a lot of people had the resources that needed to be available so that people could basically do a lot of debriefing, because I know what that was like for me. It was really difficult. In today's time, you know, like I said, I was pre-ICWA. I was the youngest of 7 kids. I never learned of my true family until I was in my teens. My brother, that is 2 years older than me, spent all of his life with me. We're still very, very connected today. My other siblings, unfortunately, have all passed on. So there's only 2 of us left. And now we're really looking at, you know, trying to reach out to other people to basically solidify a lot of what went on back then. Because again, if you have that emptiness, it is a little bit devastating. Like I said, when I visit with people, I let them know that there's areas in our life that need a little bit of help. And there are people out there and there are resources out there that'll help. And I think for my purposes, that's the thing that is the most important. My kids today, I have a lot of invested in my own children. I have 6 kids. I have 15 grandkids. And I got 6 great-grandkids. And all of them understand where I come from. I sit down again with my family. And I share with them a lot of the stuff that I've went through. And again, I do that just so that I let people know that you can rise above a lot of this stuff. There was a lot of injustice in my world in the past. I always remember when I met my mom. I was one of the fortunate ones. Like I said, in '68, I was removed. I was sitting in Little Hoop Lodge as a worker, not as a client, as a worker, when it was down here in the big red building, and I received a phone call. Now you got to understand, in 1980, I had on more than one occasion went to great extents to find my mom, and I couldn't find her anywhere. Nobody knew where she was. Or if they did, they weren't telling me. Because on more than one occasion, I would go back home and I would inquire, and nobody wanted to say anything. And so I left it at that. By the time I moved to Rosebud in 1980, I just accepted the fact my mom was dead. And I had to move on. And so now, in my mind, I got to move on. In December of 1980, I received a phone call. And this lady that ran this mission that I was a part of, the shelter home, called me. And she said, "Dwayne, I just got off the phone with your mom. She wants to see you." Wow. I didn't know what to do with that. I was in shock. But I did what any little red-blooded Indian kid would do. I hopped in my little Ford Mustang and I took off to Wisconsin. Me and my wife. And I got to meet this woman for the first time in 12 years. Little bitty thing. I think I'm small. I think she's smaller than me. My mom was 5'2", probably 98 pounds soaking wet. And it was, I transgressed back to this little 8-year-old kid. I was going to mouth that for everything I had. But it was really an interesting conversation. We spent a couple of days with her, and then of course I had to come back home. So I came back to Ring Thunder, where I currently reside. And the next time that we were going to meet, it was going to be over Easter. And so we went back home to my town. I met my mom. I gave her a star. We had a really good time. And then I had to leave again. And then the next time that we met, it was through a phone conversation. Now in this phone conversation, it was very confusing to me because my mom told me how I was supposed to conduct myself as a man, as a husband, and as a father. And I'm like, wow, this is different. And it just seemed very unusual to me. But I listened to what she said. I took it all in. This is my mom. You listen to mom. I listened to everything that she said, and we did our I love you. She said, I love you, and I said, I love you back. And I hung up the phone, and I went to bed with a very, very strong heart. I woke up the next morning to another phone call. And that phone call was, Dwayne, you need to get up here as soon as possible. And I'm like, why? And they said, your mom took a turn for the worst. And I'm like, what do you mean? And they said, just get up here. So I called my brother, who lived in Kearney at that time, and I told him to meet me in Ainsworth. And we would hop in my little car and go back and see what was going on. I'm back in my room, I'm packing my clothes, and the phone rings again. And this time, it's my uncle who lives in Montana. And he said, Shunsuke, I've been told to tell you, you don't need to go. And I said, why not? And he said, your mom died about 10 minutes ago. I'm not sure if I'll ever recover from that. But it's why I do what I do today, because even in saying that, it still affects me. And I know there's a lot of people today that are affected by this law, the Indian Child Welfare Act, in a lot of different areas. In other talks that I do, I try to get people to appreciate where some of us come from. I tell them, imagine that you woke up this morning and for the first time in your life acknowledge the fact that you were of Indian descent. What do you do with that? Who do you call? Who do you talk to? Think about that. Or you woke up this morning, you know you're of Indian descent, and you know what tribe you come from. What do you do with that? Who do you call? Who do you talk to? Or you woke up this morning, you know your tribe, and you have an inkling as to who your family is. That one question is going to cross your mind. Why did they give me up? And what do we do with that? The ICWA law, from my perspective, is one of the things that I think all of us need to really, really, really pay attention to. Not only from a past perspective, but from what it's going to do down the road and how we're even working with it in today's time. Like I said, I want to see a lot more foster families come into the picture. It is a very, very strenuous process. I think we can correct that a little bit. Like I said, what they did to me come from the state level, and I didn't appreciate that. And I am the type of person that I'll say something too. The first time that I was asked to be a foster parent or required or was wanting to be a foster parent was about 7 years ago. And one of the things that I was asked to do was to drive all the way to Chamberlain to have somebody teach me how to be an Indian adult parent. And obviously I took offense to that. And about the fourth meeting, because it was a 10-week course, about the fourth time I showed up, I asked them one question. Why are you not talking about the Indian Child Welfare Law? Because it never came up. And I wanted to know why. And so they didn't give me an answer, but the next time, the fifth week that I went, they put a little slide up on the overhead that said Indian Child Welfare Act. And that was the extent of their explanation. Again, I'm not trying to place blame. I'm just saying this is something that's very, very important to a lot of people. And we need to start paying attention because our kids are the ones that are struggling the most. I see that. I did an NPR piece a few years ago. And after that was over with, I started getting a lot of phone calls from a lot of people that went through that process. And I work with them on basically an individual basis. But I'm very, very honest about some of the stuff that they're going to encounter because they have a right to know these things. One thing that I tell them is that there might be this situation that would arise where they may not know why they were removed, and they may never know. There are other situations in which family members can't be contacted. Again, I'm going to kind of wind this down a little bit. This is something that was really interesting, and like I said, I'm learning a lot of this stuff for the first time within the last year. Back in 1982, a couple of days ago, I received a phone call from this lady, again, that ran the mission. And she told me that there was a lady there that is convinced that she's my sister. And she's of non-Indian descent, but she's my sister. And I said, I know my brothers and sisters, And I don't see how that's possible. So I don't know how to respond to that. And like I said, I was kind of dumbfounded. I didn't know what, I didn't want to say, I didn't know what to say. I just said, I don't think that's, I think she may have made a mistake. So conversation. Again, after I opened my records, one thing that I found out was that my father had been in a relationship prior to my mom and had a daughter. And I learned this a year ago. Now remember, the first conversation I had was in 1982. I got curious, so I went online to see through the ancestry thingy-mabobber. And unfortunately, this lady has since passed on. This stuff impacts us huge. And again, what I look at is that people be very, very, very honest about how it plays its roles in everything that we do. Because even though it always seems like, I think me and Justin kind of made comment this morning, like it's on the back burner, it shouldn't be back there. Because a lot of people are affected to some degree. And people need to be aware that it isn't something that's just a fluke. I mean, this affects a tremendous amount of people. Again, where they're going from the Supreme Court perspective, they're wondering if it's constitutional in that they shouldn't have even created the law to begin with. Did they overstep their boundaries in doing so? And the other thing that they're talking about deals with placement. There's a group of non-Indian individuals that think that the law is racist. And they're denying them the fact that they can adopt Indian children. But there's a whole scenario that's involved in this from a court perspective. And like I said, as time goes on, I want us to start having those kinds of discussions. I've been kicking around the idea with people at Sinte that we need to really focus on like law schools and those kinds of things around here. We have a lot of issues that we're confronted with, but we don't have a lot of resources in that area, you know, as far as to things to talk about. I've always been like an open book. People criticize me, I know. That's all you do is talk about what you've been through, Dwayne. Well, maybe if people heard it enough, they can find out that it's okay. You don't have to live in the shadows. It's hard to do, I guarantee it. The other thing that I ask people to do is when you share things and talk about things, make sure that you have some sense of where your family sits in all of this. And what I mean by that is when I did the NPR thing, I called my brother and I told him what I was going to talk about because I know that it's going to affect him. And he was okay with it. And so I did. I'm not sure what came of it. What I've learned over the years, again, is that it's really difficult to kind of gauge where everybody is as far as their own personal perspective in all this. Another thing that never gets talked about but has taken precedent over the Indian Child Welfare Act is the Adoption and Safe Families Act. And a lot of people ain't aware of that. I remember in 1996, I had a conversation with then Senator Daschle because he was one that was really advocating for the Adoption and Safe Families Act. And I said, in doing that, you're going to set us back about 30 years. And he said, no, it's not going to happen. Today, everybody focuses around the Adoption and Safe Families Act, and they look at the ICWA Act as something that's old school. So again, I'm throwing out this stuff so that people will just, maybe when we're all done, we'll jump in and look at what the Adoption and Safe Families Act is all about, or what the ICWA law is all about, or how it affects people from a personal perspective. But just know that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. People can come from a very, very disruptive background and still make it to some degree. I honestly believe that. And like I said, I've watched over the years how it kind of gains headway and then it backs away and then it gains headway and then it backs away. But we got to be mindful of the fact that still a lot of our children are being removed, and that shouldn't happen. The irony, I think, for all of this, just kind of in closing, is the fact that it was a gentleman from South Dakota that initiated the Indian Child Welfare Act in 1978. And he was Senator at risk. And the irony, again, is that in 1997, you had Senator Daschle looking at the Adoption and Safe Families Act. So when I look back at all of these kinds of things and the impact that it has on people, I hope that they take an interest in all of this kind of stuff, because again, down the road, it is going to impact a tremendous amount of people at different levels. So I think I will clam up now. Any thoughts or questions or anything along that line? Are we doing questions? Ted?
Yeah, questions?
Yeah.
I mean, I think you mentioned one time that going through the foster parent process with the state, that the state has said something to you about the tribe having some form of an ICWA office.
No.
What's the status of that office as far as, you know, do they pick up? Are they proactive? Are they underfunded? Tell us.
The sense that I'm getting is that, well, funding is always going to be an issue. I mean, it's not looked upon as a real big deal, you know, from that perspective. So I don't think that, I think they're doing what they can with the resources that they have. But again, it still needs to be a little bit more proactive. I would like to see them out in the communities or do workshops to help people understand that, you know, if certain situations come up, you run the risk of losing your children, and then taking more active efforts of getting involved in families that are going through that process to some degree. Like I said, I've worked across from the office for 22 years and never once received a phone call about what my thoughts might have been, because I was so ingrained in that system. And I'm not saying that's good or bad or right or wrong. The emphasis that I talk about is that there is a whole generation of people that have a lot to offer, and they've been excluded. So I don't know if that answers your question. I can't speak on behalf of them because I don't know that program that well. Now I'm becoming affiliated with the Child and Family Services, because once I started down that road about getting my great-granddaughter, I got it out of state custody and I got it into tribal custody. And that was important. That needed to happen. I was not happy that I even had to do that. I wish that my granddaughter was already in tribal custody, but you know, we were able to get it suffice, so now we're where we need to be. So I'm happy with that.
When ICWA is in effect, it's not in effect right now because of the court ruling, but when it was in effect, or if it becomes active again, wouldn't the tribal ICWA office automatically take control of kids who are taken away from Native families?
I would think that they would certainly want to be a strong part of it. Again, I can't speak on their behalf,
Yeah.
but if you look at the ICWA law, and that's why I think a lot of people, and I encourage people to read it, there's a whole process in play. And that's one of the court ruling, or one of the hearings that's coming up, you know, is about placement. Predominant society basically wants to have access to our kids. Some of us don't want that to happen because we feel that they're better off amongst our own relatives. And so that, you know, a lot more active effort needs to take place from what I see.
If ICWA does become effective again, wouldn't the state be obligated, if a child is taken from a Native family, wouldn't they be obligated to try to place it in a Native family first? That's what ICWA requires.
Yeah, well, it should be in play right now. But the state, again, they're not playing by the rules. Like I said, you had ICWA, and then you have the Adoption and Safe Families Act. And in my opinion, a lot of them are going toward the Safe Families Act. Because in the Safe Families Act, what it does is it puts it in a more expedited process. When I was in foster care, from 1969 up until 1980. Now they have it where that you're in that process for maybe 14 months at best. Again, that's what adoption and Safe Family did. It expedited that whole process. And a lot of people are leaning toward that way. And like I said, a lot of people, they don't understand, and that's what I mean about that education part of it. We need to be more proactive and let people understand how this stuff all plays out.
I always find it interesting, there's a podcast about this called This Land.
Yeah.
It's a really good podcast, podcast nut. But what I find interesting is,
I can hardly see you.
no, sorry, I think it's Gibson and Dunn and Gibson. The legal firm that's leading the case right now is a legal firm with its feet in the oil industry.
Yeah.
So why is the oil industry worrying about this? And what amazes me is that ICWA at its core is about helping children and families.
Yeah.
But the legal process is about defining what it is to be Native.
Yeah.
And if the Supreme Court rules for the non-Indian plaintiffs, that undercuts the rights of Native people to be able to stand up and say, we are a tribe, we are a people. Because they're trying to say, this is about race, and you can't take that off the table, as opposed to saying these are tribal citizens and their families, and the complexity of this has a domino effect all the way down through. So not only could this affect Indian child welfare, but it can also affect everything from Tribal Control College Act. Why are we paying money out for Native students to get university funding? Why are we dealing with tribal casinos and all of that? Because we're giving preference, and there's this big push against it. Once again, these children are being used as a pawn in a much broader game.
Yep.
And I keep reading about this. It just sickens me in many ways. And like you said, they heard the case in November, so we'll find out.
Yeah.
But it has some real implications. But the bottom line though is there's a whole lot of people over the last 30, 40 years who've been impacted by this, who are being forgotten in the whole process.
Again, it's about jurisdiction. I mean, at the end of the day, the question becomes, do Indian tribes and families have a right to say what happens to their kids?
Yeah.
And right now, there's a lot of doubt about that. And again, I mean, that's why this is so significant. It's a jurisdiction issue. I mean, there's so many things that are at play here that, again, I don't understand. I went back home and I talked to my tribe and said, years and years and years ago, there was a direct effect, there was basically an assault on our freedom of religion. And our tribe went to great extents to address that, the summit and congressional hearings and all of that. And I'm like, why ain't we doing anything now? I thought our kids were important. But like I said, I mean, I make jest, like this morning, again, I don't want to pick on Justin, but it didn't surprise me that I was like pushed off to the side, symbolically this morning. I thought that was kind of interesting. But it said a lot to me. It's something that I've always watched. And I don't mean any ill of that. I mean, it's fascinating, though. We have all of these concerns in all these areas and stuff, but what's more important? And in the world that I live in, our kids are the most important. That's what I look at. I mean, that's why I talk about the things that I talk about to the extent that I talk about them. Because I told myself a long time ago, I do not want any children have to go through what I went through. That was not a pleasant experience. It made me a better person, at least stronger in my head. But I wouldn't wish it on anybody. And I've had people say, oh, Dwayne, I wish I was like you. And I said, well, no, you don't. You do not want to give up what I had to give up. Now, I've gained a lot, like I said, my family today, my wife, my kids, my grandkids, but I've also paid a heck of a price for it. But if I had to do it all over again, if it puts me where I am right now, so be it. I'd go through it all over again. It's not a lot of fun. But it does need a lot of attention, and people need to start paying attention. So,
I think if we had better people that were in the roles of, like, say, in the ICWA office or even at Sichongu Child and Family Services, because all the kids that come through that program initially start off with the SS, the state.
yeah.
We don't get any kids that go through there that aren't from the state. I wish, or sometimes I feel like we were so railroad and they just take whatever we can get from the state, you know, or we get just a few minute, you know, amount of kids, we'll be happy with that. You know, that's kind of how it's played out for years and years. If we had people that, like I say, the right people in the positions of that were able to stand up and demand more, then we would have a lot more. Saying it, I mean, I know it'll happen eventually, because once, like, your generation are out, you know, and our generation starts coming into those positions of power, then I know it'll start changing eventually. But sometimes I feel like that older generation is just happy with what they got.
Yeah.
They're able to.
Kind of stagnant.
Mhm, mhm.
I just call myself stagnant. Just kidding. Yeah, I get what you're saying. I
Mhm.
understand that. Others said there's a glare off that hill. I can't see.
That's Halo.
Yeah, hello, Ronnie. A lot of you know, some of you I don't. My name is Conrad Eaglefeather. But I am also an adoptee. I was removed from the tribe back in '65, approximately. And I've had a lot of the similar experiences that we have, Dwayne. We both were removed and about the same time frame, and we lived in the same town in Nebraska, knowing each other's situations growing up, but still not that close, for whatever reasons. I struggled to find my own way back. It was a struggle. Through the different red tapes, through the things I was told by my foster family, through different things I heard all the time I was growing up. I too went through tumultuous life of addictions, but I'm grateful to say that I'm about 10 years old.
Okay.
This university here also taught me what I needed to do in order to move forward. It gave me a sense of who I am as an individual, as a Lakota, as a human being, as an adoptee, a place to start, something I didn't have before. Because when I first came back to the tribe, it wasn't shortly, I was here just a few years. My mother passed. I grew up in a society where you didn't ask for things. I didn't know that tribe gave travel to the buried parents or funerals and such thing. I asked the tribe for assistance to go bury my mother. He said, no, we don't know you. I heard. After all these years, coming back. And it's still like that. In a lot of different areas, as you well know, we don't know you. Who are you? Because we're not the vocal ones. I have since gotten my bachelor's degree from the university here, which I'm very grateful for. I use it more for self-knowledge, self-learning, and self-application. But I haven't found a place yet where I can apply it. I don't know how. I struggle in a lot of these areas. I have severe attachment disorder. All of these things that I struggle with on a daily basis, people don't realize, people don't even think about.
Yeah.
talked to SGU, upper management here, a couple of years ago when we did the welcoming back. They had no idea what I went through as a student coming back. As a non-traditional student, the struggles I have. I tried not too long ago to apply myself as also as a foster parent, but I am up against such obstacles when it comes to SWA and tribe. It causes another feeling of hopelessness and helplessness. What do we do with that? I don't know. I don't have the answers. But I do know that I'm grateful that I found my way home. I'm grateful for the teachers I had in my life here at SGU. Some of them are sitting around this room here. Some of the people I've been associated with. I've got good friends here. Hanging on to them is my trouble because I don't have that attachment. I too used to go back to the foster home where I was kept. There's a lot of abuse, a lot of physical abuse. I was hung in a tree as a young boy over a set of wheels off of a tricycle. I used to go back and visit that tree until I sobered up. I didn't understand why. After I sobered up, I haven't gone back. So a lot of those things I'm able to move on from. There's these challenges now that I face each and every day I don't know what to do with. I thank you for your work and what you're doing. It's good to see somebody from back home. Like I say that, you know, getting your work coming from this population of people. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen. One of the other things that I did back home is I called our Indian Child Welfare Act office and I asked them to give me a number as to the number of children that were taken. They didn't know. Again, this was pre-ICWA. So my point very simply is that this does affect a lot of people in a lot of different ways. And every now and then you'll come across individuals that get choked up and you're like, what's wrong with you? And that's why. Some word or some smell or something like that. I remember I was sitting in a psychology class one night and we were having I think we were having a little dinner or something, but one of the students brought in a great big pan of cinnamon rolls. And holy moly, man, that really caught me off guard. Because I just kind of went blank there for a second and I was like, wow, what's that all about? And I remembered when I was a little bitty fella, not very big now, but when I was a little bitty fella, my mom owned 2 houses, had 10 lots of land. Now remember what I read in this book, these poor little Indian kids, we don't have a family, we don't have no place to go, blah, blah, blah. They were talking about me, but my side of the story is my mom owned 2 houses, 10 lots of land, and there was this particular lady that wanted to rent my mom's house, the extra house. And my mom was very adamant, nope, that's for my boys, that's my boys' house. And so she wouldn't rent it to her. And then, I don't know all this is going on. So me and my friends, we're all playing, and we get up on the side of the hill, and there's a woman that's up there, and she's cooking. And she's making cinnamon rolls. And she's offering them up to everybody until I get there. And I don't get one. Now, what I concluded from that was probably the lady that my mom didn't want to rent from. So, that was it was really interesting. It was these little snapshots. And I think Conrad will attest. We get these every now and then. It still affects us. And I know that, like I said, we always need that place where a lot of us have somewhere to go. And down the road, those will come to fruition. But there's certain individuals that I'm aware of, they're a phone call away. And I make those phone calls because, like I said, some of these memories, they don't go by the wayside. They're constant reminders about how we kind of maneuver through life. There was a song that my mom would play, and it was Bobby Vinton. All you old people know Bobby Vinton. Mr. Lonely. My mom loved that song. And I got to hear it. I mean, that was the last song that I ever heard before we were removed. And the reason that she always played it, because again, if I speed up, I talked to somebody at the ICWA office, or not ICWA, DSS one time, and I said, I've often wondered, if my mom had an adult male in my home, do you think that I would have got to stay? I just in jest. And they said, well, yeah, probably. I mean, that would have made a difference. And I said, that's really ironic, because there were two people at that time that qualified as adult males. And they were my brothers. But both of them were drafted into Vietnam. And that's why my mom loved that song. And like I said, even today, when I hear that song, it takes me back to that. I mean, that quick. And like I said, I don't mean these as good things, bad things. I mean, they're a part of that memory that a lot of us have. Another song that's more my generation. How many of you are familiar with Michael Jackson? No longer with us, but no Michael Jackson. But, there's a song that he sang, and it was called Ben. Remember Ben? Ben was a rat. Why that song meant so much to me was because I was that rat. That's how I felt in 1973. But as I listened to that song, in my mind, I was like, if this guy can accept a rat for who he is and have feelings for him, maybe there's still some hope for me. I mean, that was the mindset back then. I mean, I tell people, you wake up. Before I was removed, I had a family, a huge family. My grandfather, my grandmother, all of my mother was the oldest of 10 kids. There was no reason why I should have been taken, but I was. And again, I tell people, imagine that you go to bed tonight in this circular environment, this teepee. Because my grandfather was a roadman in Native American church, so I physically grew up in that environment. And I said, go to sleep tonight, and before you close your eyes, you acknowledge everybody in there. They're all your family. You wake up the next morning, and you're in a box, a room, AKA room. You open your eyes, and you can't acknowledge one person in that room. You have no idea who they are. And sit there for like 10 or 11 years, try to figure out what happened, because nobody's going to tell you. Now, granted, I've had a lot of years to put it all into perspective, but from 1980 basically up until 1987, I was in oblivion. I was still finding my way around, and I was always grateful again that Sinte was here, because I was able to jump in these kinds of books and look at these different things and try to formulate some kind of an idea as to what really happened to me, because nobody was going to tell me. Nobody was going to explain what a little 8-year-old boy, why was I a threat? Why take me? Like I said, I'll never know the real reason, I suppose, but it was what was going on back at that time. And if this ruling comes down and it goes against us, that's what we have to look forward to for the rest of our kids, because that's what's going to happen. Our children are going to be taken out of their environment and placed someplace else. Again, that's why I think this is so important, and I want people to rally up, start saying something. Earlier I was listening to people talking about, our young men today. We had a warrior society years ago. Doesn't mean the fighting, but it's the mind. Giving them that purpose. I jokingly always tell, when I was a little tot, again, I had a role in my family. I was the water boy. We didn't have the inside running water, the luxuries we have today, and electricity was few and far between. But I got to be the water boy. Without me, nobody washed, nobody ate. I had a really important role. And I would always start out with this bucket about yay big and have it full of water. By the time I got to my destination, it was down to there, and most of it was on my leg. But at least I did my part. In today's time, we've taken all of that away. Everything is so simple today, but it's almost simple to a detriment. My kids today, they all have responsibilities, and I make sure that they understand them. I do to my kids what my mom did to me in that last phone call. Showed me how to conduct myself as a person, and taking that time to do it as a family. All these years later, we still cook our meals. We don't do the fast food thing. We still take time to cook a big meal. That still has to happen. So all of those things that, I always tell people, we had a way of life that has sustained us since the beginning of time. So why are we giving it up? It had meaning, still does today, and we can always go back to it. Any other thoughts, questions? Marlies?
Yeah, about 7 or 8 years ago, when we became aware of this issue, we became aware that 25 to 35% of all First Nations children were adopted or fostered out. So we started to look at that and how we could welcome people back. But then the larger issue is, what about all the birth parents, birth extended family that have lost the children? So while there's a lot of trauma here, it's underlying trauma that so many children were lost, but it's the children, and then it's also the birth families. And for the birth families, there's often a lot of shame because they couldn't do anything to stop it. And so when we started to do this, to look into this, almost every family I talked to had lost someone, either to adoption or foster care, or they had a foster child or 2 foster children in their family, and then all of a sudden social services would come and remove them, and they never knew where they went. Even when I talked to Lionel about 7 or 8 years ago, he told me about, in their family, they had 2 foster children. And he said one day they came and took them, and we never found out where they went. So I mean, it just affects so many people. I think every family here on the reservation can identify with it. But again, it's something that's hardly ever talked about. We're not aware of it, and so I'm hoping that SGU will continue to teach, about it so people can learn. And this morning I learned that if ICWA goes out, then it would be up to the states to have their own law. And Minnesota has a law
Yep.
to prevent that from happening.
Okay.
But of course, South Dakota doesn't know how you get it through South Dakota, but it's something you probably should start on, just to be prepared. So I appreciate Wayne's talking, sharing his story, and all of the work that he's done around this, and Conrad as well, and all of the work that he's done. And what I found with the people that I know that were adopted out and they've come back, they are very generous people, very committed people. And, they work in a lot of different areas, they do a lot of work on the side, on their own, that no one knows about. And, they truly are members of the nation because they're serving their relatives.
Thank you. Still can't see. We done, Ted?
Right. Yes, we're done. I was supposed recognition of this as an issue, I think we're still at the place of assumption. So there is an assumption of incompetence. And what struck me, not only about your story, but what I've read, is that, so we assume that the custodian, or the parent, whether it's a single mother, whether it's a pair of people, mother, father, we assume that home is incompetent to raise the child. But very little is done to actually help address what that perceived incompetence is. And I was just sitting here thinking about it because I started my life out as an archivist. The first attempt, I should say first attempt, one of the early ways that the government took land away from people were these lists of incompetence. And so in the 1800s, even as we started to see a lot, there were these allotment records. There was this person incompetent, this the superintendent would say that. And then they would take their allotment away from them. And so that land became Bennett County. That land became Tripp County. And so now it's like a continuation of this rather than saying, as I was reading about all of these young children are being taken away, they're being put in homes for a while, now they're being put in people's families as foster care, but the person, their crime may be that they're poor. And it's not a crime to be poor, but that's how we're being used. And right now, to take it up to the next level, which is why I'm curious with Marlise, is her program, she's working with social services and seeing this. And the government in South Dakota says, we don't want to change Medicare and Medicaid funding. It kind of gets down to that. We don't want to actually put money toward solving a family problem. We're just going to take the child away, ignore this, and just claim this as incompetent. We'll just take this child and turn it into somebody else. I just think about that. I think it's still there. I don't know if is that what you're seeing. Social services still have that mentality of a person is incompetent first, as opposed to saying, how do we help you become better at being a parent?
I think it's a matter of resources. There's resources to take children away, but there's very little resources to sit with the family and really work with them on a real consistent basis. And also educating social workers. I heard a story a couple of years ago. We showed that movie Blood Memory in Rapid City. It was kind of a film fest. And afterwards we went out to eat, and one of the men there was a relative of one of the people in the film. And he's a veteran, hardcore veterans. Well, he's in Nebraska actually. And he was on the council in Nebraska with the justice system. And so one day they called him to court, and a young woman had lost 4 of her children because the social worker said she didn't have any food in her house. She had done a home visit, there was no food in the house. And so the judge then asked this veteran to be there. And so the veteran said, Judge, I think we need to go to her house and see if she has any food. And so they got up and they all went to the house, the social worker, everybody. And the woman opened her cabinet, it was all commodities. She had commodity milk and cereal and everything, And the social worker had said, I opened her refrigerator and there was no food. And so the judge said to the social worker, people live in different lifestyles. People have different resources. And you need to get educated. You're educated in your way, but you need to be educated in how other people live. And so he said, I'm returning these children. And, it was just fortunate that that man was part of the system where he could speak up. But again, children were taken away for the wrong reasons, and they were put in homes where there was terrible complex issue. I think it's very, very simple issue that, you know, instead of removing children, find out what's going on and then help them
Yeah.
so that this doesn't have to happen.
You know, along those lines, Marlies, and also Dwayne, what you're asking, why don't we mobilize, how could SGU make a contribution? Well, Richard Mooskamp, given his experience both in ceremonies and also counseling a lot, that overlap, he really has a desire to see SGU start a degree in social work. He talks about that a lot. Now, there's complications, there's certification issues and all that for a master's degree. But in terms of educating social workers, is it something to consider for the Human Resource Department, for example, to start a strand on social work? So that you have local people, you still have to have the relationship with the state, but that could be part of the development of the curriculum too. Is that something that you guys would consider as maybe one strand at least that could be developed on this side?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very relevant, because the lady that I was working with through the state before my granddaughter went over here, I asked her, I said, so have you ever read the Indian Child Welfare Act? And she said, no, we're not required to. I'm like, I mean, that kind of freaked me out, but she didn't want a copy of it, which I gave her one, and then, like I said, after that, we transferred, you know, into the tribe, so I don't know if she'll bother reading it now, but it was really interesting to me that, you know, she was very adamant about, we're not required to read that. You know, what's that got to do with us? So I thought that was kind of interesting.
I find it interesting, I was looking down at Cheryl's famous, I didn't realize how famous Cheryl is. Because remember when they started talking about a course for school teachers related to Native students? And Cheryl was known in our world. I mean, I kept running into Cheryl Medearis went to this meeting and we thought she was going to tear them apart here. And because the recognition that school teachers need to have a sense, and it doesn't matter if they're on reservation or off reservation, they need to have a sense of these Native students in their classrooms. Hopefully history, hopefully culture, you know, there's things. But is there a similar requirement to be certified as a social worker in South Dakota, to have that kind of a course under the belt of a social worker?
Well, if there isn't, there needs to be.
I think as a university, if there isn't, maybe that's one of the things that we should be pushing. And that's where, you know, we would look to our human services departments and what are these certification requirements? What does this look like? How can we push? You see, take Leska, this Medearis down there led the charge in many ways. I mean, I was hearing about that for quite a few decades now.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think SGU can play that role of saying, there should be something here.
Yeah.
In that preparation for these people. I mean, yes, we need to do a degree program for our own communities, for our own students, but the broader university structures and systems, we need to be impacting that and saying, you need to do this. We have the governor right now who's trying to get rid of all that.
Yeah.
But we can see just from, you know, this is really good conversations.
Mhm.
This is another piece of
Yep.
how this should be made aware in that broader system.
Yep.
I think we need to remember too that we have a few Native people working in the system. You know, whether it's Pierre, Rapid City, you know, we don't have very many over here as well, but they face a lot to try to help their own children, and then they're up against that system themselves. That's difficult for them, so it'd be nice if we did have some type of program where we could train more social workers or whatever to be out there helping. But they have to talk out there too as well.
Even with mental health assessments, do therapists ever ask, were you adopted? Or did you lose a child to foster care for adoption? Those
none in writing, but some of us, like I said, that come with that background, we'll ask them.
Yeah, if you ask, but
But we're aware of it, but nobody else is.
Right.
I think what Ted's talking about, I come from a school that said, just do it. You know, just do those kinds of, if you get to a point where people are a little bit offended by what you're doing, I'm sure they'll tell you. But in the meantime, just start doing it. That's what I've always done. I just do stuff. And if people, you know, threaten me like, well, keep doing it, and this, well, so be it. But at least I'll get it started. It has to start someplace. You know, I was talking about leadership and all that stuff before. You just got to step up and jump in. I mean, that's what it's going to boil down to. That's where the bravery and all this stuff comes from. You know, it's just not a word we throw around. We actually do it.
when you mentioned about a summit,
Yeah.
I thought, wait, why don't you do that?
I thought the same
And
thing.
start a summit.
right here.
You know, University can support that. You
And
need to
invite
just-
mental health professionals, social workers.
We could have a big summit here at SGU. Our doors are
I mean,
open.
I know the potential. I mean, I've always said this, and anybody that knows me knows I say this all the time. We have always had the resources for anything we've ever wanted to do. And why we don't just do these kinds of things, it baffles me. Because I've seen the potential. You know, clear back to when we started that sobriety walk many years ago. That came from a group of 5 people. And that turned this reservation upside down. So I from a spiritual perspective, I see the potential. I've always seen it. But I always wondered, you know, whose place is it to do that? Because we have all of these programs. That's why I said I think, you know, this whole room should be filled with people that are affiliated with the ICWA in some degree. But I understand why they can't be here. Maybe they're online, I don't know. How many is online?
One of the research projects I did as a student here through Sanford Sure program was about the adoption and removal of Indian children here and how it began
Okay.
a long time ago. All of that information is available if somebody wants to look at it. As far as I know, it's been SGU property.
Okay.
But it goes and talks about all of that. Even, I think 3 or 4 years ago, when I did that research project, even back then, they was talking about, they're just talking here about,
What exactly last night?
our Seatongue family taking the BSS portion of the children, the adoption and removal of children away from BSS. And that's what led me into that research project. Even at that time, some years ago, the state had been instructed to further educate their social workers, all of those people in those offices for some time now, as far as I know. But even in saying all of that, even in my own search for a therapist, even surrounding recovery, it never ever once came up as an underlying issue, which to me, it was the very foundation of my issues. All of that underlying stuff surrounding my removal and adoption and everything that came afterwards.
I was a little somewhat familiar during that period of time with the research. We did have an IRB committee and these were papers that were written.
I know you have something to
And there
offer,
are probably
Justin.
many of those.
Jump
that
in here.
We could ask people to voluntarily bring those papers forward, that we can think of how do we use our own students' work to inform other people in the classes, talking about how do we update those things, how do we look at them, instead of buying textbooks from somewhere else, talking about how we do those. So I am aware somewhat of, you know, the work that Conrad and his class, other people in those classes did. So maybe we could ask people through some forum to bring those forward. You've written things, Dwayne, for yours. I've sat in on when Human Services used to do presentations of their projects. We should be, you know,
Is that it? Are we there?
I would like to see SGU do more. I would like to see the tribe do more. I'd like to see the state. I'd like to see a lot of things. But we're here in the room. We're at SGU. What can SGU do to help this population? And as Marlise mentioned, the shame in the families, the shame that they carried, you know, why were our kids taken away? That's a big issue, and it's almost become a forgotten population. The shame that the relatives carry that were taken away. It's a lot of that's been kind of brushed under the rug, and it's been coming out more and more. Marlise talked about the welcoming back, and then I thought about that too, and that was good. That was good to welcome those relatives back, but it kind of hit some of them in a different way. There's a lot of different emotions, but I think the idea of a summit and maybe SGU leading the way on that would be a great idea. And I know myself, and I know a lot of people that would be willing to help with that in any way possible. But I think it would be Dwayne to probably take the charge and, you know, head it up. The resources would be there, but somebody that has the experience, the knowledge, you know, people like Conrad to come and share if they're willing to. And I know a lot of adoptees. I know a lot of people who grew up in foster care. And Marlise was so correct when she talked about them being generous. After my accident, time to build my wheelchair ramp, 2 of them were adoptees from that population. The people that come and check on me to see if I need shoveled out, it's them. And I think we should give them that same love and respect in return. And I'm willing to help in any way that I can, but I would like to see where this goes and see what SGU can do. I think the idea of the courses in social work, I think that would be, I would sign up for those classes. My wife would probably sign up for those classes. I think that would be great. And to maybe educate our families on how to become foster parents. We need foster parents, native foster parents here. But what more can be done? And that's kind of where I'm going to go away from today with this is, you know, my mind's been turning all afternoon listening to Dwayne, and the question in my mind is, what else can I do? What more can be done? You know, I know we're talking about the Supreme Court case coming up, and if they overturn ICWA and do away with ICWA, there's going to be a lot of challenges, so we might have to start preparing for that, have some plans in place. What would SGU's role be in that? What kind of resources available, even down to counselors, therapists, helping families be stable enough to where they don't have to worry about their children being taken away. And one of the things that I talked about yesterday, and I heard it mentioned today, Dwayne wondering if there was a male in his home, would he have been removed? Working with Chihuahua Kinipi, that bringing the family back to life. Most of the families I work with, I don't see a hot day there. I don't see a dad there. And that's a huge part of historical and intergenerational trauma, is the removal of that roles from the hot day and how that was dealt with over decades, generations. So I would like to see something geared towards fathers, working with our young men to, a lot of them might need to be taught how to be a father because they didn't have one at home. And that kind of sounds crazy. I mean, I had to learn how to be a father. I was just thrown into the mix one day, and but having some resources like that for young men, that's also related to this issue. But I've had all kinds of thoughts about it today, and they're just swimming crazily in my head right now.
My work is done.
I always enjoy listening to you, Dwayne, and I have a lot of love and respect for you, and I appreciate what
Thank
you've
you.
shared and what you do for the university.
I just want to add, yesterday we talked about that, working with the Head Start program, they have what they call fatherhood activity. And just on a personal note, my daughter moved home with her son, and he was at Head Start, and the teacher pulled his mom aside and said, we're having fatherhood activity, and he said, my daddy lives in Spearfish, but I got a grandma that could come. And so they were looking, for somebody who they could, and I look at the men here, and I think, for the little boys that are 3 to 5 that don't have somebody when it's fatherhood activity, I've always said to male students, if we get any of the teacher program, could you go to Head Start when you know when those activities are, and just be there as a mentor, because they don't have, one dad shows up and that kid's the star of the show, and the other kids feel, kind of left out. So if we could do small impact things like that, to go and just to sit and have lunch with them and to talk about what is it you want to do and be, and have those opportunities. Yeah, there's so many opportunities that we have. Again, going back to Nora saying, what if you bring people together and use a model like that and talk about what can we do? What can we do to recruit people? What can we do to reach out and be that helping hand to those who are 3 years old and those who are way older, whatever. We have a lot of wonderful resources here. So.
Well, I know I heard through the grapevine, which is a very long vine, that one of the things that Sinte wanted to start up was doing talking circles, like in the evenings sometime. And I heard that through the grapevine. And I think that's something that needs to happen. Initially, it's going to kind of go south. Nobody's going to show up. But as time goes on, you'll find that John Doe, Pete Doe, and Dodo is going to show up, and it'll grow. And that's one of the things that I've seen, and I'd be more than happy to be a part of that process. Because I think that's something that needs to happen now.
Part of the challenge of institutions, I think back to my friend Bruce Longfox. I looked up a quote on my cell phone because I'm holding my brain. I always have to look things up. But Bruce used to have a Margaret Mead quote on his wall. And it was, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. And I think about that because Bruce, if you know him, he was the book ed director at OLC when I first met him back in the 80s. And he said, the biggest challenge we have is our fathers, what you just said about fathers. So we started the advocacy program in Rapid City, not from any institution, but from a group of men who started just coming together, the talking circle idea. Here we are, let's talk about this, a group of people, rather than saying, let's wait for the institutions, which have all these different, you go into my office, you'll see on my whiteboard, there's probably 20 things on the whiteboard, all happening at once in St. Ocean. From the really impactful work of your program to the work that Cheryl's doing, to IoT and trying to establish a welding program and more CTE courses. The list just goes on and on and on. But I think our challenge as an institution is to be a place where this small group of people can say, here's a room, let's use it, let's sit and talk together. And then from that, let's build. To hire, Dan and I have had conversations about faculty and what's the role of faculty. Well, the role of faculty, because I used to be one, and part of the role of faculty is to teach people your courses. But it's also, you're getting paid a salary that gives you a little bit of time to do that next thing. We label it with things like professional development and all that. But in the context of a tribal college, maybe that extra time you have, faculty member, is spent in small groups talking about what is possible. And then taking it the next step. How do we operationalize that, which you are talking about? Trying to create that synergy, so to speak. So I can see this happening. That's what SGU is, really. It's not just, here's an administrator up here saying, do this, do that, do this. It is people who sit around and say, what's possible? And sometimes those people lose energy, and they kind of, oh, we did this 10 years ago. Well, yeah, with that group of people. Now there's a new group of people. Let them talk. And maybe they'll pick up things that we did in the past and take it one step further. Just keep doing that, and that's how you make that change. Kind of like what Nora was talking about this morning in terms of helping bring people together to talk about issues so that they can then move forward and make that change. But it all starts with those small conversations. Like we said, let's have well, that was in the context of the open gym, I think we were talking about. Let's open up this gym in the evenings. Of course, this was pre-blizzards. But our goal is, and it still is, we've updated the workout room, got new equipment, we gotta get that ready to go. And then we're gonna open up the gym. I think Midas and Dan were talking about maybe some evenings, 2 or 3 nights a week, we have this place open. We have a place for people to come and sit and talk. And I talked to Dwayne about talking circles, and maybe that's something we need for mental health. But the important thing is, the institution does a big thing. It's just a small group of people starting, and from that small group growing out, and building something.
I think one of Lionel's favorite statements was 2 words that are only 2 letters. If it is to be, it is up to me.
Yeah.
And he
Two letter
tells
words.
us all the time. So if we want to do a summit, let's do it. Pick your committee.
We're all in here.
I think about, you're all in. Right now, I'm really struggling with our current governor, I have to admit. We had a governor, Larry Dugard, who had his feet firmly in the social work field before he became governor. And I think we could reach out to him and say, would you come? And would you participate in a conversation? Not to say you have to do anything other than just come here and be part of a conversation. But he would give a avenue into that part of the world. If we're going to change the whole region, if we're going to change the reservation, who do we bring in from the tribe? That small group that starts here, and think about how does that then, what are the other circles that we need to bring in and make it grow. So turn it. If, like you say, if it's going to be, we have to be a small group of committed people. Lionel said. Dan, what's the plan?
Thanks for saying that, Marlies. I think we need to remember like that. He's only not even gone very long, and it doesn't seem like people are talking about him that much anymore. He built this place, so I appreciate you saying that.
Yeah, I was really happy to hear his grandson make that statement after we had that gathering with the staff and faculty, because I remember him saying that often, And I know it motivated me to start some things. Let's not just talk about it, let's do it.
Let's put that on let's run that on the message board at the library.
Yeah.
That might be a good statement to throw on there, and just for people to read and maybe get inspired or motivated. they could read that on that board. If it is to be, it is up to me, and then they could have his name. Might be something to throw up there and inspire people.
And I think students could be involved in this.
Mhm.
They could have a big role.
I think a lot of people could be involved because there's nobody here that's not affected. Everybody's affected by it.
One of the challenges is with these small groups of people is that when it's someone's passion project, it often gets carried far. And then when you institutionalize it, to give more resources, then sometimes it gets bogged down. And so you're always stuck in this place of, it feels like there's few people to carry a lot of water. But I think one of the opportunities we have at SGU is that our classes could and should be the places where this kind of stuff is developed. And I could totally see a class saying, every spring, this is our class project, is to put on something in human services. They say, this is our class project, the things we're learning, we then turn it into, and our culminating project in this class is to run this summit. And then it has a home, but it's not one or two people having to carry it. It's part of an institution, and it's connected to these resources. That's the kind of thing that I think these forums can be so powerful to bring up these ideas, and then we as a university have to say, okay, so now what? Well, what do we do with it? Let's not pretend like it's going to happen with nobody doing anything. If it is to be, it's up to us. It's up to me. And finding homes for these things, we're saying we're not the right people to do it. You know, and if we say we are the right people, then let's figure out how we can turn it into action. Which I think is a good segue to the next session that we were supposed to do, which is when we were planning these, that's what Phil said. Phil and Cheryl said, let's make sure we don't leave these forums without having an analysis time where we talk about these ideas that have come out and say, is there a next step for us? What should that be? What do we do with this now that we've had these people share with us? We've had these stories, we have these different presentations fresh in our mind. So that was what this afternoon was originally designated for, and I'm glad we pivoted and created extra time to have this conversation. I guess for Cheryl, just in this moment, we should figure out where that next, since we're about at 3 o'clock, which is when we were originally going to end, when should we have that time to
The plan was for us to take from each one of the sessions and what were the takeaways from that session, and then tie it to what can we do next, what are the next step plans for that. So, I don't know if a plan might be to take each of the sessions, or a few of us that were here for all of them, but if you were, what could be the takeaways? Get some notes down, or would another plan be then to carve out a time where we could say, here are the takeaways? Sometimes in the past, we've asked for people, we did like World Cafe thing where everybody wrote down things from their groups, which is kind of the plan we had. Anyway, people had written things that they brought down to email to us, what individuals' takeaways were from those. I struggling with what would be a structure that we could say from every one of these, what's an action item, what do we need to carry those through? So an action item from today might be, as we talked about holding a summit, that's the action item. Then meet together to say, well, we need to bring that. Everyone doesn't have to be that big, or to use papers from students that have written and gone through that to say, here's what here's what we contributed and they have to share.
What about tomorrow morning?
Is it gonna be, the summit gonna be just for child welfare, or is it gonna be for the whole group?
The whole thing.
Sovereignty.
Yep.
So from a practical,
Yep.
like back to what I'm hearing, can we, because I like to operationalize things, so can we come together, I think everybody here works here, so we can just, Can we come together like about 9 o'clock tomorrow, right? We could not be so spread out in the room, because I feel like we're all far
Yeah.
away.
We'll gather up there by the
We can
whiteboard.
gather up there by the work whiteboard. I brought some paper.
I'm getting self-conscious with that camera on.
Yeah. And can we then sit down and say, these are some
Point
of
it
the
at
things
somebody
that
else.
we've been thinking about the last 2 days? Because what Dwayne just talked about was extremely important, but it also has implications for the health of our community, and which I can draw from what I heard from the food sovereignty conversations, talking about the health of families and creating space, and the same thing with what Nora was talking about, and even, and yesterday I had to be at a meeting at the tribal council chamber, so I missed a big chunk, but I was sitting there thinking about what was being said by Sage and the language. All of these things can thread together. We can all sit and think about this overnight, sleep on it, so to speak. We can come together in the morning and write out and say, here's some takeaways. And some of those takeaways, I would imagine if we were to pull, and maybe I'll look to Dan, or maybe I'll just do it myself. I could pull out our strategic plan, which some of you have been part of. I think all
And
of
look
you
at
are.
that.
And say, what did we say here? And, because I'm sitting here thinking, well, this isn't a strategic plan, and this isn't a strategic plan. How do we then take this to the next step? So these ideas are percolating around, how do we take it? What's the next step? Who are the small groups of people that are gonna make changes, and then how do we encourage them? So, could we reconvene tomorrow? Sure.
My only dilemma is I have a 9 o'clock class, which I already missed this morning.
You can't do it.
Just bring them along.
Let's go to your class.
Huh?
Let us come to your class.
Could do that too.
Have it in your class, yeah.
Yeah. It's my drug and alcohol class, you know what to bring.
Drugs and alcohol.
There's a lot of people that come, so they're not really.
Oh, hey, we're still on tape.
And then that's the thing, it's like.
Disregard that last word.
If they're told about the summit and they're giving like an overview of what happened these last 2 days, then everybody's involved, it's not just small little groups.
We have
That are
some people
here.
on the 10th.
So what is your time for your class?
9 to 12.
Okay, I didn't hear this.
Didn't you have those people who ran the original breakout session of this? You write a takeaway that they want to start.
Yeah, thanks.
Would it be better for us to meet at 1?
That works for me.
All right.
I don't think this room, Cheryl, we're not doing it with this room tomorrow.
Success.
Tomorrow is Thursday,
So
so
they're just gonna set up, I don't know if they're using this room because of the food they're cooking down there, they probably not. I don't know,
I don't know.
I don't know.
I thought they were cooking in, well, I'm not sure who's cooking.
They're cooking over there, but they're bringing everything over here to feed.
So at 1 o'clock, you think we could just use this room without having too many people? Or we could go over to, yeah, this would be all right.
Human services.
It's gonna stay set up like this, so.
Yeah.
So, and we don't have to find all the solutions tomorrow.
No.
Tomorrow is about bringing the ideas that came forward, clearing them up a little bit, and then find time to take them to the staff. Next
And
training.
it would be helpful if you could email all of the presenters and say, what are your takeaways? Have them email us back. I really, that's a really good idea.
Even what OJ shared was really
Yeah.
important and our, I didn't know.
Yeah.
I think that's a good idea. One year when we were gonna have the forums, I went and met with Lionel and I said, this time when they have them, at the end, could we come out with a list of things we're gonna do? And he just kind of was like, oh, yeah, I'm not a planner, and maybe you are, and all that stuff. And then we had a staff meeting a couple days later, and Lionel pulled, they were starting the forums, and Lionel pulled a paper out of his pocket. And he said, Barb gave me this when I went home for lunch. And she said, when you have your forums, could you at least come up with a plan?
So why don't we get together at 1? I know, I was just telling Dan, we have, right, we have this reestablished, this is anything new, but we reestablished the idea of monthly, all staff meetings. We didn't get one done in December because of the blizzard. really appreciated, you and Mrs. Farmer going around at that one in November, because that was a tough one. But we're gonna go ahead and have an all staff on the 10th of February. We'll have another one in March, we'll have another one in April, so that people can come. And it's important that all the staff come. I hesitated to say these are mandatory, because when you start making things mandatory, people get grumpy and they don't want to participate. So I'd rather people say, this is something that I find useful. If we give them something useful, they will come.
Let's do it in the student lounge and have steaks. We had good participation that day.
Yeah, mandatory steaks.
Mandatory steaks. Oh, man, Marley. Well, after our presentation on food sovereignty, we can't afford steaks. If ground hamburger or ground buffalo is $11 a pound.
Buffalo steaks.
Well, we all know Buffalo.
That's true. So Cheryl will go out and drop the buffalo and we'll butcher it. Okay, so is that the plan? 1 o'clock tomorrow?
Sounds good.
Okay, we'll come here, same bad time, same bad.